Hello everyone, this is Sanjay Parashar. Welcome back to the channel. And today we will learn about how you can obtain more control over file polling in file or FTP adapter in Oracle SOA. So by default, polling starts as soon as the endpoint is activated. That means whenever a file is placed to the inbound directory, it starts polling based on the given polling frequency. However, to obtain more control over polling, you can use a file-based trigger. Once the Oracle file or FTP adapter finds that specified trigger file in a location or a remote directory, only then it starts polling for the files in the inbound directory. So for example, you have two people processes, and one people process is writing files to a directory and a second people process is polling from the same directory. To have the second process start polling the directory only after the first process has written all the files, you can use trigger file. You can configure the first process to create a trigger file at the end of its process, and then second process starts polling the inbound directory after it finds the trigger file. Interesting, right? However, there are a few things that you'll need to keep in mind. The trigger file directory can be the same as the inbound polling directory or different from the inbound polling directory. However, if your trigger file directory and the inbound polling directory are the same, then you should ensure that the name of the trigger file is not similar to the file filter specified in the adapter configuration. And one more thing, the content of a trigger file is never read. So it should not be used as a payload for the inbound receive activity. So we'll do a demo explaining this trigger file, and in that demo we will do these three things. First, we will read file as they come to inbound directory and insert the file into the database. So initially we will not use a file trigger. We'll simply read the file content and insert into the database. Then we will add the file trigger option to control the polling of the file. Once we set that, then the polling will happen only once the trigger file is placed to the trigger file location. Third, once file is polled, adapter does not automatically delete the trigger file. So we need to figure out a way how you can delete a trigger file, and as you should know, there is no delete operation in file or FTP adapter. So we need to sort of figure out how we can delete it. So let's start with the demo. So let's create a project. I'm naming it as file trigger demo. In the exposed services side, we will use file adapter, which is for the local directories. However, the configurations or the concept is same for FTP also if you plan to read the data from a remote directory. But for our demo, we will be using file adapter. We'll use the default JNDI. So we will be reading the file, and I have already created the directories. So this is the directory that we will be using to read the files from, and we will delete after all the files are read. The moment we read the file, we'll delete that file. Click on next, and the pattern, we want to read CSV files. So I'll just say CSV, whatever the name is, doesn't matter. If the extension is CSV, we want to read that. We click on next. Polling frequency, let's say 10 seconds. And here it is, use trigger file. You can check this, add trigger files, but we'll do it later on. Initially, we just want to read the file the moment it comes to the inbound directory. Within 10 seconds, we want to read it and insert into the database. Later on, once we test that successfully, we will use this use trigger file. So let's click on next. And I already have some demo files to create the schema from. So for that we can use the schema builder. Basically we need to create a native schema because we will be reading a CSV file and getting the data in an XML format. So let's click on next. It's a delimited file, comma separated. Let's give that file one of the file name. So these are some sample files that I have created. So we can take this test one, which has multiple records. Let's click on next. So these files have some dummy data which we would want to insert into a table that I have already created in the database that is installed in my system. Let's click on next. It's a comma separated, and each data value, column value is not separated by anything, so we are not adding anything here. Click on next. Here you can change the column names also. So for example, we have employee ID, we have employee name, we have status, and we have designation. And click on next. So our native schema is created. We can test it like this. It will generate the sample XML for us, so it looks good. Click on OK, next, and finish. So our schema is created. We'll click on next and finish. So now our file adapter is configured. Now let's configure our database adapter also. So this JNDI data source, everything is already created. I will not explain it again because we have created multiple videos on that. So if you don't know how to configure your database in WebLogic server, then I would highly recommend that you check out the videos that we have created on database. So I will not be explaining all those things in this video. So we want to basically insert or update into the database. So we'll click on next. We'll import the table. The table is employee record, which has 4 columns that you will see just now. And these are the 4 columns: employee name, status, employee designation. We'll click on next, 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 and finish. So pretty straightforward so far. We have created a file adapter where we are reading the CSV files to a certain inbound directory, and then we have a database merge operation where we can insert the data that we are reading from the file. So let's create our people process now. To receive the data from a file, we'll use receive activity. Create instance has to be checked so that your compiler would know this is the first activity that needs to be implemented. Click on this plus to create the variable. And now we'll need to invoke the database adapter. Fair enough. Now we'll do the mapping between the data that we received from a file and the data that needs to be inserted to the database. For that, we can use XSLT. So the source variable will be the data that we received from the file, and the target variable will be the data that we need to insert into the database. We can rename the mapping file name, file to db mapping. Alright, let's see if this auto map will work or not. It is working. So here we are telling that loop over each employee data and map employee ID to employee ID, name to name, status to status, and designation to designation. As a matter of fact, I think this is good enough for us to show that now this will poll files as soon as they appear in the inbound directory. So let's just deploy this quickly. So compact domain is the one that is running right now. So the service is deployed. Now let's check the database also. So this is the table that we are inserting the data into, and as of now we can see there is no records in it. So let's put an inbound file there. So let's put this test1 file, which actually has 3 records in it. So this is the test1 file, which has some 3 records of dummy data. Let's put this file to the inbound directory. Now the service is deployed, so in 10 seconds it should read this file, delete this file. As we can see, it is deleted now, and ideally there should be 3 records in our table. Here you go. So 3 records in our table. Now let's put more files to it. Let's just suppose we add 3 more files, which has each file has 1 record. The moment we put it and wait for the polling frequency to kick in and read the content of these files and delete it from there and insert it into the database. So now as you can see, it is working as expected, but as of now we don't have a lot of control over the polling. We have said that okay, after each 10 seconds check in the inbound directory, if the file is there, read it and put it into this folder. But quite often we might run into a scenario where we need to have a little bit more control over this polling. So for example, we want to schedule this polling. We want to say that okay, read only at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, or there is a process which is putting files into one folder, and there is a task that read only once it has put all the files that it needs to put in the inbound directory. Or another scenario, which is a common scenario, that there is one file and source system is keep on appending data into that file. So we don't want to read a file where we do not have the complete data. So in those scenario, it is recommended to use the file trigger. So that if the source system, once source systems tells you that okay, now the file is complete, you can read it. So it's source system's responsibility to put a trigger file into the trigger location. It basically lets your service know that okay, now read whatever is there into that inbound directory. So now let's try and do that. So for that, let me delete all the records. Now we don't have any records here, and now let's update the file adapter to use the trigger file option. So we'll use this use trigger file. Now here you have 2 options, whether you would want to give a different directory just for the trigger file, or you want to use the same directory which your inbound directory is for the polling of this particular service. So if you want to use the same directory, you will need to check this box. So you see it takes the directory by its own, the inbound directory which we gave initially. If you want to give a different directory altogether, uncheck this one and give a directory name here. So for example, I'll give the trigger file name is poll.txt, It could be anything, it has to match exactly as per your trigger file name. And I have a different directory for the polling, so let me copy paste that directory here. So this trigger file location will be our trigger file directory. I'll put the name here, next, next, and finish. I'll save it. And I will deploy it. And it is deployed. So now let's go to the directories. So now I'll add these 3 directories to the read file location. Initially, after every 10 seconds, the service was polling these files. But now our scenario is that don't read files unless your complete files are there. So if you see, it is not polling now. It is waiting for the trigger file. So now your service is basically not reading this location initially. Before polling, it is reading this location, whether this location has a poll.txt file or not. And these 3 files can stay here forever, but it will not poll unless the trigger file is there in the trigger location. So let me put other files also. So now test 1 has 3 records and 2 to 6, each file has 1 record in it. But again, it is not polling as of now. Right? So for that, I'll do poll.text. If you see in this, doesn't matter what because it will not read the content. Our service will not read the content of this file. So it could be anything. It could be a text file, a PDF file, anything, doesn't matter. It just the name is what it matches. I'll put this file here. So now after 10 seconds, our service will check, oh, okay, I have got the trigger file and now it's time for me to read all these files, and as you see, it is all deleted. And if we come here, we'll see that it fetched all the records and put it into the database. So that's how your file trigger works. It's quite straightforward and simple. However, one thing that you need to keep in account now is, if you see, this poll.txt has not been deleted. So the next time I put a file into our read location, it will again poll after 10 seconds because the file is there. So the practice is, once your job is done, once all the files are triggered or all the files are polled and whatever business logic that needed to be executed is executed, then it's your job to delete this file. However, your file or FTP adapter does not have any delete operation, but there are some tricks that you can do in order to delete this file from there. So if it's a scheduled process, then the recommended way is that you scheduled a service which will delete this file. Or if you're reading just one file or one large file based on the file trigger, then in your process itself, once everything is done, you can create an adapter or file adapter to delete this file. So in our demo, what we will do is we'll create something within our process to delete this file. So let's just do that. Let me delete the employee records for the simplicity purpose. Now our table is again blank, and in order to delete the file, there are multiple ways. You can update the JCA file and make certain changes and create a delete operation. But I personally don't recommend that because sometimes it might not work. So what I do is, or what I personally do is, I use sync read operation to delete the file, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's say delete file. here I know that in the directory I have a file poll.txt which needs to be deleted. So I'll sync read it, and if you see, delete file after successful retrieval is already checked. So in this I will put the trigger file location. So let me copy paste that. Next, and we know what the file is. If you don't know the file is, and then you can get it dynamically also and set it into your invoke property as we have shown in other tutorials. But as of now, in this demo, we know that this is the trigger file, so we can give the name. It reads this file. However, keep in account, if this file is not present there, it will error out, because with sync read you have to have that file which you are trying to sync read. So click on next. We don't want to read the content of the file. As I mentioned earlier, we don't want the payload out of the trigger file, so we can use this opaque data here, and we don't need to define the schema. We'll click on finish. Let's wire it, and after the invoke db, we can invoke delete file. Now this input and output variable, it actually means nothing. Input will be blank, output will be the opaque data. So now this will basically delete your file from your polling directory, from your trigger file directory. There are other ways to do it. Now if you leave it this way, it will work. However, if you Google it around, you try and figure out some different ways to do it. There are ways that you can change this delete file.jca and create and delete operation. Like you can create a move operation, you can create a rename operation, but in my personal opinion, I don't recommend that way. So here under this, you can delete a few class name, and you can create type as delete and all those sort of things. Okay, but I don't recommend that way. Okay, just to show you what it is, let me add that data in the comments here. So that's how it will look. Under the class, it will change to file IO intersection spec rather than file read intersection spec, and target physical directory, target file name will be poll, and type will become delete. This also works. I have seen it works, but I have also seen this fail, so I don't recommend it. So let me deploy this the way that I want to do it. I want to sync read and delete that file. Let's deploy it and test it. So it is deployed, and now let's put a file. So we already have the trigger file here, but our file location is blank. So let me put our one file to the read location, and after 10 seconds, because poll file is already there, it will read it and it will delete this file as well as the polling file. So this is deleted. That means our read worked. Then let's check the 3 records. So 3 records are inserted. That means our database adapter worked. And let's check trigger file location. That is also blank. That means our sync read worked. And then next iteration, your source process or whosoever would want to trigger your process would put another file here. It will read the files from the read file location, and once your system works, it will delete it from the trigger file location. However, if you are reading multiple files, then my recommendation is that don't put this delete operation within your composite if you are reading one file in one transaction. If you want to read multiple files within one transaction by listing the file and looping over each file, then after the loop you can delete it. So that's what it is. I mean, it was quite simple, but a very important aspect of file and FTP adapter. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you so much for your time, and you take good care of yourself. Goodbye.